Well, hello and welcome everybody to Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush, author of Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foes. Dr. Keynoush, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Well, I suppose I'll start by asking an obvious question and ask you to answer your own question, which is today, as we sit here in the region, as I sit here at least in the Gulf, are these two regional powers friends or foes?
They're neither friends nor foes, and they've never meant to be friends or foes. Their relationship is predetermined by how they retain a relative power balance between the two of them. So it doesn't help either if one gets too strong and the other too weak. And that impacts the entire region that they are in the Middle East and in the Gulf region, in multiple sectors and arenas. And I think that we see the manifestations of that frequently, especially when there are power imbalances between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Well, I mean, we've seen both of those powers back, various sort of regional conflicts, both active and passive over the years in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and of course, most recently and evidently in Yemen, we saw a Saudi-led Arab coalition also resisting the Iranian-backed Houthi movement. We also saw this year a new Iranian government, of course, elected, a new more conservative government, one could argue. So does that make any difference to the future sort of direction of how these two countries act?
You might be surprised to know that generally when Iran is led by more conservative governments since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, that Tehran has been more inclined to reach out to Saudi Arabia rather than under reformist presidents. Now, this does challenge some popular conceptions of the Saudi-Iranian relationship. If you remember, under the reformist president Mohammad Khatami in the 1997, around 1997, there was a brief moment of détente between Riyadh and Tehran, but it didn't last very long. And oftentimes under reformist governments in Tehran, Iran's leaders prioritized relations with the West, with Europe, or with the United States, for example, as in the case of the Rouhani government, which led the nuclear talks with Washington. But when conservative governments take hold of power in Tehran, mindful that they have an issue with the West, they try to put Iran's neighbors first and their relationship with Iran's neighbors first. That does beg the question of why would they want to prioritize ties with Saudi Arabia at the moment, given the conflicts between the two. The reason is that when tensions increase between Iran and the West, Saudi Arabia helps it to serve as a buffer. In other words, if Iran can ease its tensions with Saudi Arabia, it has an easier time managing its tensions in relations with the West. And therefore, with the new government in Iran under Ebrahim Raisi, his policy is to put Iran's neighbors first, including Saudi Arabia, including Pakistan, in an effort to reach out and ease tensions around Iran's borders in order to then figure out what Iran wants to do with the West, with the United States, and with the nuclear talks. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have, as you said, seen, at least the start of a new dialogue between Iran and Saudi. Perhaps it's been triggered. What has triggered that? Is it, let's look at that. Is it that we have a new president in the United States, do you think? Or is it to do with any other thing which is more regionally focused?
Well, it certainly has a lot to do with the fact that we have a new president in the United States. The United States plays a pivotal role in maintaining and ensuring a power balance between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that is pretty obvious why it has that role. it is because the United States has played a central role in the Gulf region. From a security perspective, from an energy angle, et cetera, et cetera. So we cannot take the United States out of the calculation when it comes to the Saudi-Iranian relationship. Under the Trump administration, because President Trump was quite hostile toward Iran and exerted a maximum pressure policy on Iran, obviously Riyadh and Tehran drew farther apart. Under the Biden administration, the policy of maximum pressure on Iran has so far been abandoned in favor of developing a mechanism to live with Iran. As a result, Riyadh and Tehran have drawn closer. But having said that, the Saudi-Iranian discussions, direct talks, began sometime in April, once the Biden administration came to power, but it was still under the government of Hassan Rouhani in Iran. But the talks actually picked up after Iran's elections and after Ibrahim Raisi assumed the presidency. To date, the countries have held 5 rounds of talks, and the latest one was just happening a day or two ago, continually in Iraq.
Yeah, and I mean, those rounds of talks that you're referring to focus on, obviously, the nuclear, let's say, they focus around the issue of the nuclear deal. Of course, had been already agreed to after many years of the US sort of trying to broker that, broker deal with Iran directly. And of course, when President Trump came in, he withdrew from that deal, or at least started to place more conditions on Iran in order for the US to remain in it. More restrictions on Iran, its missile program in the region, etc. And Iran wasn't willing, obviously, to play ball. Now Biden has come back in, as you said, and has indicated he wants that to rejoin, let's say, the JCPOA. But at the same time, we have President Biden who is also indicating that he wants to withdraw, generally speaking, from the region. He wants to withdraw US commitments. He's just, we saw the fiasco of how the withdrawal was done in Afghanistan a month ago. But how do those things coincide? Do the Iranians feel convinced that Biden is serious about sort of US brokering, in a brokering kind of role in the region?
Somewhat. They are somewhat hopeful that the very fact that the Biden administration is aiming to have more of an over-the-horizon monitoring of Gulf events rather than being fully present in the Gulf region is reassuring to Iran, which since its revolution has always urged and called for a region free of foreign power interventions, in the words of revolutionary Iran. One of the basic parameters of the Saudi-Iranian relationship and the strength of that relationship is how it can stand on its feet alone without extreme foreign interventions. Saudi Arabia and Iran are nowhere close to that point yet, but with the Biden administration gradually withdrawing the United States from the region as a direct actor, Riyadh and Tehran are left with their own devices to figure out how to live together as neighbors. And if we really go back to the history of their relationship, they were living with each other quite all right as neighbors for a very long time. And it was only after the Second World War, when extreme levels of foreign intervention in the Gulf region accelerated, that their relationship then became contingent of what foreign powers did in the Gulf region. So there may come a time when they might be able to rebalance that relationship based on what they're capable of. But I would add that we have a far way to go before reaching that point. And Saudi Arabia particularly recognizes that. It has said, its foreign minister has said that the current level of talks with Tehran are really exploratory. And I would add that they really are contingent on the outcome of the nuclear discussions between the United States and Iran. So if those talks fail, we cannot be certain how willing Riyadh and Tehran are at that level to maintain a relationship, irrespective of the outcome of the nuclear talks.
And what is it going to take to have a diplomatic sort of breakthrough, if you like, in those talks? They've been, of course, carried out. the nuclear talks by proxies for Iran and the US, to an extent by France, by other European powers who are trying to sort of at least keep that momentum going. What would it, where are we nearing the final stages of an agreement on that front? As you said, it's been 6 months. There was a point in the summer where we had a bit of a sort of very positive, hopeful viewpoint of a deal being reached, and then suddenly everything went quiet.
Well, I can tell you how Tehran is looking at this. Tehran is looking at itself being faced with two parallel talks, one with the West and the United States, the nuclear talks, and the other one with Saudi Arabia. Now, it does feel that it has to maintain the talks with Saudi Arabia no matter what. And it has, according to reports, indicated that it wants the reopening of embassies in Tehran and Riyadh as a precursor to the continuation of further talks about security in the region, etc. Whether Saudi Arabia will agree to that remains to be seen, but I think the two countries have had a fair amount of discussion about how to embark on a path of renewed relations, formal relations, in order to then continue the discussions further on security issues, etc. But why Iran is emphasizing that, to me, indicates that it's still not clear where it's going to go with the nuclear talks with the United States. So it wants to secure the relationship with Saudi Arabia as a surety for the time being. Regarding the nuclear talks, which is the second parallel talks that Iran will be leading, Tehran has said that it will certainly return to the talks in Vienna. And as of yesterday, a time has been set for that within about 3 weeks. But at the same time, it has made it clear that it is unwilling to renegotiate a new text, a new kind of nuclear deal or addendums to the existing nuclear deal. And I think—
And do you think the US will play ball with that? Or now that Trump's gone, is the US happy to go back to, I mean, it in principle said it was, but the Biden administration has also been saying, well, actually, hang on, given the sort of regional activity that we've seen in the Gulf in the last couple of years, the skirmishes in the Straits of Hormuz, et cetera, and a bit more than that, we do need to maybe put some new conditions in there. Is the US likely to do that, or are they going to try and sort of get a deal while they can?
That's a brilliant question. I think that if the Saudis and the Iranians figure out what they want to do between them in terms of maintaining regional security, then Washington might be more willing to stick with the original text of the nuclear deal. So I would say it remains to be seen.
And how much, Dr. Keynoush, is the pressure domestically in Iran, economic pressure? Let's put politics aside a bit and talk about the immense amount of strain the Iranian economy has been under for years, principally because of sanctions, obviously. And they had a bit of light relief when this nuclear deal was reached in 2015, and then here we go again. How much is that pressure economically for Iran pushing it to try and reach a deal, and would it in fact make it compromise in any way so that they can get some relief from sanctions?
That's a complicated question, and it's complicated because Iran has left two roads open for itself. The first obvious road is that it will have a nuclear deal in place and that its markets will reopen to the world and things will be all right. But the second road is, well, what if a nuclear deal cannot be had? If a deal with the United States cannot be had, then what does Iran do? And for that scenario, Iran is planning to build up its regional contacts and connections, but also to really mobilize its economic resources nationally. And as we know, it's quite a wealthy country still, despite huge economic mishaps. But back to your question, I think that Iran's economy is really spiraling downward at the moment. It's in a very hard position, and that does influence its decision to negotiate both with Saudi Arabia and with the Western powers. And the negotiations with Saudi Arabia are very critical in this respect because Saudi Arabia is a major energy player, as we know. It has taken on a lot of markets that Iran had presence in China. Iran's oil exports to China have declined by over 90%, as you know better than I do, while the Saudi exports to China have increased by 55% in the past year, and other neighboring countries like Pakistan. That impacts Iran's security, not just its economy, but its geopolitical and strategic thinking as well. So for that reason alone, Iran, I believe, will continue to talk with Saudi Arabia and will continue to hold the nuclear talks for the time being.
And yes, and as you mentioned, oil, obviously, and Iran has lost a lot of export revenue, and it's still leaking and getting some oil to China, I believe, according to the sources that are out there. But again, they're talking now again, Saudi and Iran, but what are they talking about? I mean, what are they trying to resolve? What are the differences or compromises that they could possibly reach?
It's a very good question. From the bits of information that have leaked, from somewhat credible resources, anonymous diplomats here and there, or people present in the talks, it seems to me that they're really talking, at least from Iran's standpoint, Iran is really pushing for a bunch of confidence building steps. There is apparently some talk, for example, that Iraq may have forwarded to build a road between the religious city of Mashhad in northeastern Tehran via the religious towns in Iraq into Mecca to kind of open a pilgrimage path. And as we know, Shias in both Saudi Arabia and Iran have continually traveled and made the pilgrimage on this path. There are other talks, as I said, reopening relationships or embassies, or at least maintaining consular level relationships, and a bunch of other ideas that have been forwarded. But in my view, confidence building measures are just that. The real test to this relationship comes when they are able to agree on a distribution of power within the region. To what extent are they willing, for example, to work together in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen? I think they've had some initial talks about that. And I think Iran has encouraged Saudi Arabia to invest in Syria and in Iraq. Iran has always done that. But again, these are only at the level of confidence building measures, and they are not enough to ensure the longevity of the relationship moving forward yet.
And would you say that the US is involved in any of that behind the scenes? I mean, you said there's two parallel paths here. You've got the Iran-Saudi talks and what everyone else is doing together. But how, would the US be getting involved in that part of, yes, how much regional power does each one have, or what's the new relationship going to be?
I would say that's an essential component of it, because the United States did contribute to that imbalance of power for a long time by siding too much toward one country versus the other. So it's upon the United States to redress that, and the Biden administration might be willing to the extent that it can. Reports also indicate that the Biden team has been pushing forward for these talks. Robert Malley, for example, who's also, the Iran center point for the Biden administration, has had previous experiences trying to bring the Saudis and Iranians together. So that is valuable. The United States has to kind of be there as a party that will ensure that power balance between the two, and the rest of it has to be worked out by the two capitals.
And how much do you think the Biden administration, is going to give? I mean, he has a lot on his plate right now domestically. He's just to go back to the question of how committed his administration will be to the region in general. A lot of domestic issues there in terms of the expenditure plans that he's trying to get on with, his agenda there. COVID obviously has been a big challenge, but that's subsiding to an extent. Going forward now, and you've got, of course, midterm elections coming up in the US, next year. So where is that going to leave the US in terms of its commitment to trying to sort of help forge this diplomatic breakthrough in the region between these two powers? Or would you say it would start to lose interest?
The United States is very preoccupied. I can tell you that just living in the United States, and it will remain preoccupied for the foreseeable future. Where that leaves countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia is that either they figure out what to do with their relationship, irrespective of what happens in the United States, which I'm not sure they have the ability to do yet fully, or their relationship will remain an extension of what happens, what priorities the United States will have at any given point of time. And as you said, with the midterm elections coming up, with the uncertainty of future elections in the United States, with the rise of the evangelicals in the United States and their policy priorities toward the Middle East, there will remain a high level of uncertainty in the shaping of the Saudi-Iranian relationship. For the sake of the world, I hope that Riyadh and Tehran can figure out a self-contained relationship on their own in order to be able to withstand the changes that will take place in the United States in the years to come.
And what about Europe? Does it have any role to play anymore diplomatically?
Europe's role is limited. If Europe can part ways with the United States, and kind of make its transatlantic relationship secondary to Europe's interest to the Middle East, then obviously Europe will have a more prominent role to play as a peacemaker in the Middle East. Europe is not there yet. It is trying, I think, especially when it comes to the Saudi-Iranian relationship and to building security. We have to see where Europe goes with that.
Well, Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on Halftime Talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.